So excited to be here, and I'd like to begin really at the root of why dragons exist in the first place and why we're hosting this workshop, which is our mission and vision. So you can see it on the screen there, but Dragon's mission is to cultivate meaningful connections through immersive and responsible travel. Our vision ultimately is to foster a more compassionate, just, and inclusive world. Those kinds of meaningful connections don't always just happen on their own. They require, especially when we're connecting across difference, they require intentional conversation and action. So that's a main reason that we're here today, is to begin one of those intentional conversations that we hope folks will take forward with them into their travels well into the future. In this call, we'd really like to think about the concept of identity as something more expansive, more layered, and more fluid. That's really a process of identity formation rather than just a particular label. So, of course, all of us have an internal identity, a self-concept that's about who we think that we are, how we would describe ourselves to others, or how we describe ourselves internally, maybe in our journal. And of course, we express that identity outwardly to others. And then likewise, everybody else also has an internal self-concept. Seems obvious to say out loud, but sometimes we don't always kind of name the fact that everybody has that internal identity, and they're also expressing that identity outwardly toward us. So in our relationships, we come into this negotiation of our external expressions of our identities to each other. And those all take place in the context or with the backdrop of our social context. So that could be where we grew up or the society that we're used to, the one that we're currently in at, physically in a particular moment. Could be micro context like our family or our city. So that's thinking about things like the laws that are surrounding us, the religions that surround us, our economic status, for example, or ideas that might be normal in our cultural environment about certain types of people or what certain identity markers mean. We really want to think about identity on all of these layers as a negotiation between our internal senses of self, how we express those to others, how we interpret the expressions of others, and how those interact with this broad social context in this constant push and pull that is always impacting the way that we might express ourselves and also the way that we view ourselves. So with that kind of framework of the dynamic identity in mind, our goal today is to help prepare ourselves to connect more deeply with others by using this idea of that identity negotiation to spotlight the ways our identities shape and are shaped by our experiences, and also highlight and explore the ways that travel provides a really special opportunity to explore who we are in a different way by putting us into a new context.
Without further ado, I am very excited to introduce to you all our expert travelers, Paola, Hannah, and then Liam. And I'll pass it over to you guys to introduce yourself and share a little bit more about where in the world have you spent some time.
I'm Paola from Potosí, Bolivia, in the Andes region of South America. Well, I had the chance to start traveling quite like in the middle of my 20s. After I quit a job, I decided to embark a journey through South America, and I spent traveling like 2 years doing different volunteer works, woofing, and doing many different things. And after this, I ended up being in Europe for quite a long time as well. And this was interesting for me because I was able to experience something super different from my own place and reaffirming how in love I am of this side of the world, and how much also I appreciate my own place and culture. With dragons, I have been working these past 5 years, and I had the chance to be running programs in Bolivia, of course, in Peru, in Mexico, and of course in Guatemala. And yes, I think this work and traveling I have the chance to mix these big two passions that I have, that is for one side, having the chance to travel and exploring, but especially, even though the places are super important, the people, it's what make the places special, right?
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Sachs, she, her pronouns. I'm currently in Westchester, New York, about an hour outside New York City. In terms of regions I've traveled to a lot, maybe in the Dragons context as well, is I've been to a lot of Southeast Asia. I've had the privilege of traveling there with Dragons in Myanmar in 2019, in Indonesia, and looking forward to instructing in Thailand this upcoming summer. And Southeast Asia and China is just a region very close to my heart. Just a couple identities that I'll touch on later is I'm a Chinese American adoptee. Consider myself a transracial, transnational adoptee, which is a mouthful, but basically means I was adopted into a family with a different racial background than my own and across countries. And I was raised in a white Jewish kind of upper middle class family in New York. So I'll touch on that later, but nice to see you all.
Hey everyone, my name is Liam. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm up here in northern Wisconsin. I live on the south shore of Kichigame, also known as Lake Superior. And I came on to Dragons in the summer of I guess that would have been 2021, to support the development of programming actually here where I live in northern Wisconsin. And the programs are focused on cross-cultural learning with the Ojibwe people. I live in the homelands of the Ojibwe people here up in northern Wisconsin and more broadly in the region too. So that's what I've been doing. I've also done a few programs in the American Southwest and across the border in northern Mexico. Going to Guatemala again this summer, which is exciting. And before working for Dragons, I worked in language immersion for a long time in French and Chinese programs. I grew up in a multilingual family that spoke French and Chinese. Grew up in this small town in Wisconsin, but also spent a lot of time growing up in China, a little bit in France, and yeah, just like moving a lot between cultures and communities. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, and I'm really happy to be here.
How does the way that you express your identities to others change in different contexts? Why do you think that is?
I think in Bolivia, for example, it's unique how these subjects are starting to be discussed. Sexual diversity, for example. Also, I recognize that this can come also for some ignorance that before colonization, for example, here in this part of the world, we will have this third gender. And with colonization, this has been also erased. And in my case, also my expression, my sexual expression, for example, my identity in this matter changed a lot when I'm in bigger cities or smaller cities in Bolivia. Let's say there are a better understanding or a little bit of more acceptance in bigger cities, but there will be always the questions about also how I will be taking care of myself, why one day you can wear makeup and why other day you don't, why you have short hair. So there are a lot of conceptions or expectations here that, okay, women should look in that way. You look, well, it's very different. It's, as I was telling you, in the bigger cities, I would say that it's easier to express in bigger cities than in smaller places, right? The same with countries.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of my racial identity, so I identify as Asian American. I usually say Asian more than Chinese, to be honest, because I wasn't raised within Chinese culture. So even within my own family, I'm the only person of color, the only one with my kind of ethnic background. So I always stuck out. I was raised in a community where I think it was 90% or so white, maybe like 40% Jewish. So there it was less of a minority in terms of my religious identity, but there was always that sense of othering. So I remember the first time I went to Asia, I felt like a true sense of being anonymous. And that was something that was actually really liberating, not being the one to stick out in a crowd, like to be able to walk from a subway station to my homestay and not have people looking at me or asking why I was there. I mean, when I opened my mouth and they heard my accent or they saw maybe how I dressed, there were cues that I might not be completely local, but it wasn't like I was sticking out with literally every step I took. So I think that was something that was interesting. And then on the flip side, growing up in a very Jewish community, I think I took for granted what it meant to be surrounded by people with similar cultural traditions, but then, going out in places around the world where some communities have never heard about Judaism as a religion, or maybe I was the first Jewish person they met, or the first non-white Jewish person they met. In that instance, there was a lot of that tokenizing or feeling like I was asked to represent an identity that I didn't feel comfortable being the spokesperson for, but found myself in that situation often.
Have you had any opportunities to educate others about your identities during your travels, and what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I often find that when I travel, I get into conversations with people about my identities, and it can look really different depending on the context. Like different parts of my identities will come up. Like for example, when I spent a lot of time in China, people were always really curious about me as an American and would ask a lot of questions about what life is like in America, what my experience there was like. I mean, I would just start talking to people on the street and they would just like want to know all these things. And I got to share a lot with them. And I found that really fun. It's kind of a more like light, I guess, like lighthearted sharing of experience and identity. I don't, I haven't had like being a queer and gender fluid person traveling. That's not usually like the part of myself that I guess like come off with or like present as first. I do a lot of like sussing like people and contexts and situations before I feel like comfortable bringing that part of myself out in like visible expressive ways. I have had some really sweet experiences having conversations with folks as I travel about those parts of myself and teaching about it and also like exchange and learning from people. I feel like that's a little less common for me, but it really depends on where I'm at too. Usually it is a positive experience. I really like sharing about my identities and yeah, talking to people about them, whether it's like really feels like teaching them or it just feels like a mutual exchange of experience.
Can you talk a little bit about like what are some, I guess, like signs or situations that let you know that it's okay for you to share other pieces of your identity?
This is like kind of goofy, but like maybe a lot of people have heard of the concept of gaydar. This is like kind of a term in the queer community that we use to talk about like the sense that you have of whether other people that you meet are queer or gay or whatever. I think it's used like pretty generally. I would say it also encompasses just like being trans and like meeting other genderqueer people. It's a very real thing. And it's yeah, there's just like a lot of social cues, I guess, and like expressions of people that like signal different identities. And I pay a lot of attention to like language that people use and people's body language and like depending on how I'm presenting on any given day, like how people are reacting to seeing me and interacting with me, and like how I'm reading them reading me. And if that's like, sometimes it's really obvious that like, oh, this person feels like is looking at me weird and feels uncomfortable with the way that I'm presenting. And I'm probably going to be like a little more reserved and I'm not going to be so open because that feels uncomfortable. And maybe it even feels unsafe depending on like how I'm perceiving them. But yeah, I think a lot of it is like going by feel. There is also just like a level of deep knowledge of like where I am. In some places, I just know that like there is more likelihood that I'm going to be around people who are maybe have more like transphobic beliefs or homophobic beliefs, and in other places that's like less of a thing. Kind of like how Paula was talking about earlier, it definitely can have a lot to do with like being in cities or rural areas. Not always, but I think there's that level of it too, of just like knowing where the place that I'm traveling through, knowing the place that I'm traveling through and knowing about it through experience, but maybe also through like stories and anecdotes of others, and knowing what to expect.
So as I was sharing before, I think this opportunity to talk with people about exactly what is diversity, that how we can expect that one person it's going to be the same in Brazil and all the people it's going to look like that Brazilian person. No, the variety, it's like a rainbow itself, right? So whenever I get the questions of, but you don't look Bolivian, I always ask, what are the expectations? Sometimes people will be thinking like there are certain type of facial features or so that's challenging sometimes, and also it's interesting how my identity sometimes will be changing, or this is a learning opportunity as well for the students as for myself when we are with groups, let's say here in Bolivia or in Peru, and I will be the only person of color with the group, right? And how that will be also changed, or how that will be different with how I'm being treated. Let's say if I want to use the bathroom, and if I'm alone, probably they will be charging me. But if I'm with a group of foreigners, I will be able to use the bathroom. So it's interesting how it will be changing always when who you are in the moment, let's say.
And I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you manage your emotions in situations like that?
Yes, Gracie. Well, thank you for the question. I remember on my first program, that will be the most challenging thing because I was the only person of color in the entire group. That means that even my colleagues were white, two men, and it was very challenging. I didn't understand what happened after that program. But then with the experience and having the chance, and nowadays my items regularly are from the places. Let's say I'm going to be working with 2 Guatemalan people in Guatemala, or I'm going to be working with 1 Peruvian and another Bolivian in Bolivia. And that's something special as well. But it has been very challenging. I think I have been learning with the practice, of course. And I understand that also this is very different for one people and another, of course, because for some other people, these things will be like, okay, I will have other colleagues from Bolivia that will say like, oh, it's not such a big of a deal. But for me, in some point, it was like, wow, I started to reflect a lot also of how I'm being perceived in my own country. So it's a learning process, I mean, a learning opportunity with no ending.
The more I've traveled and the more I've been exposed to different people, different questions, different challenges, maybe my responses have also become more refined or I've adapted them. But I think, I faced all types of questions. I'd say, especially with the adoption question, there's a lot of very personal questions that I think my friends don't even dare ask me, that sometimes strangers do, like, have you ever done a birth family search? Do you want to? Do you know your medical history? Like all these questions that, I would never ask someone I've known for 10 years maybe, but people feel like they can ask. I think at first it was as just a very kind of reserved person to begin with. Uh, I would be taken aback and sometimes want to answer that person and make that person feel heard, but maybe at the expense of like what I wanted to share. So I think over the years, I've really learned to set my own boundaries and decide like which part of my story I want to tell, which areas are off limits, if that changes depending on the audience. Like if it's someone I know I'm going to be working with, like a co-instructor for the next few months, and we want to build rapport, like the answer I would give that person would be very different than maybe the answer I'd give to someone in the street who just sees me with my family and then asks me afterwards, like, oh, tell me about this. Like they're entitled to an answer. And I think I've become very good at like figuring out when someone's asking and there's like genuine curiosity versus someone who's kind of crossing boundaries. So that's something that I also try to read, like the context where we are. Maybe that person has had like less exposure, and I'm the first person they really feel comfortable asking about certain identities versus people who are just trying to play like devil's advocate and I can tell don't really care about the answer or maybe a longer term relationship. So I think yeah, going back to your question, that's something that I really worked on over the years, and I think is important in Dragons contexts too, because we engage with so many different people. I think for a lot of our students, it might be the first time where some of these questions that, you know, for identities they took for granted are now coming up or being challenged, and like giving others the benefit of the doubt, but also knowing it's okay to change the topic and not answer everything that you don't feel like you want to answer in that moment. um and I think also just having someone to like process with, maybe it's a few days later, weeks later, whatever, is really important, because I think for me personally it takes me a while to like just reflect on what's happened and to figure out internally, how that made me feel. So I think being able to express that kind of delayed can also help in that process.
Would you share some advice to someone with similar identities considering traveling?
Some advice is just, it's going to sound repetitive, but know kind of when to set boundaries, know when it's okay to, not want to talk about certain parts of your identity, or like I like to have certain responses in my back pocket as well that I can kind of give in a pinch and say, if someone asks, and be like, okay, here's my 2 sentence answer, here's my 5 sentence answer, whatever, almost like elevator pitches, but about my own identity, that I can kind of pull out if, I'm drained or don't want to fully engage, but still want to respond in some way. So I think, yeah, for people with similar identities who are maybe have a lot of intersectional identities coming into play, like just thinking about what you are comfortable sharing at kind of that base level, and building some responses around that you can draw on when needed.
Speaking to like people with queer and trans identities thinking of traveling, I'd say, kind of echoing something I said earlier, like learn about the places that you're considering going, do some research. There's a lot of information available, of course, on the internet. I would also like highly recommend try and find on the ground perspectives from queer and trans people in that place, because queer and trans people are everywhere. Social media is great for this. You can find people who are just talking about their experiences, and you can learn quite a lot about what it might be like to be there as a queer trans person. Of course, also considering like, your layers of identity and what other things might be affecting what it's like for you to be in that space. But yeah, like learn what you can about the place, make a plan based on what you learn. Like, are you going to feel comfortable expressing your full like gender identity in that space? Or maybe your plan is to mask and pass in a way that is going to feel maybe safer or more comfortable. And think about like, how's that going to feel? Like you might get some data, decide that if you did travel to this place, you might need to like mask for a prolonged period of time, and then think about, is that something you want to do? Is that going to be really hard for you? It's really easy for some people. It's really hard for other people. So really consider, like, yeah, is this a choice that you have the support systems, you have the capacity to make, and for it to be a healthy, growthful thing, and not maybe like a stressful, scary thing. Yeah, and I'd say too, just like, remember that just because people maybe don't understand your experience or your identity, it doesn't mean that they can't like grow to know you and care about you and love you. And I've had a lot of really wonderful experiences connecting with people who I know would be really uncomfortable or are uncomfortable with parts of my identity, particular in relationship to my transness and queerness. But sometimes that's worthwhile. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Sometimes that can be a really beautiful thing.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.